Question goes to Mr. Angus. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've received a number of questions from citizens through open media, and many of them, I think, are questioning the bigger issues in terms of regulation and how we start to move towards what you call dealing with these tech giants as utilities. But one of the questions that I think staring us in the face is, how likely is it that Cambridge Analytica, SCL, were the lone operators in this big field of election manipulation? Were there and are there other players out there that we should be aware of?
So the way I look at it is Cambridge Analytica is the canary in the coal mine. Cambridge Analytica is the beginning, it's not the end. And that what CA has exposed is how easy it is to misappropriate information, take funds from mysterious sources, and then go and interfere in elections, particularly in cyberspace. And what it really shows is how the internet and the growing digitization of society has opened up vulnerabilities in our election system. Elections historically feel like a very domestic, insulated activity, because previously, if you were a foreign actor, you'd have to physically come to a country to interfere. Now you don't. And so I think, moving forward, we need to look at cybersecurity as a priority for elections, and that we have to understand that we may look at social media as domestic political players, as a communication space, as scoring points or messaging. If you are a malicious foreign actor, you look at it as an information battlefield. And so you don't look at these people as voters, you look at them very much as targets for manipulation and targets for division. And so I think there needs, and this is why transparency mechanisms or requirements for online platforms that do any advertising in the political space, would be a really helpful first step, because that would make it a lot more difficult for a country like Russia to start to interfere in elections if that has to be done in public.
Well, it would be really helpful if you could send our committee some recommendations that we should be looking at, because what really struck me was when we had Facebook here was they seem to have a very cavalier disregard for the damage that was done through the manipulation of their platform. And I see Facebook as having a revolutionary positive potential. Certainly in my region, connecting isolated Indigenous communities, it's been transformative. But when we ask questions on, for example, the horrific ethnic slaughter in Myanmar, and Facebook's unwillingness to police its own network or to deal with the calls from UN NGOs, they shrugged. So how do we come up with better mechanisms to protect democratic elections, to respond to this kind of misuse of platforms by these third-party operators?
So I think one of the biggest things that I've learned in this process is I get a lot of the same questions and see a lot of the same problems with the different legislators and governments that I've been dealing with around the world. And one of the things that I've also seen is how, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, refuses to appear at any of the other committees or investigations around the world, save for Congress and his very brief meeting, if you can call it that, at the European Parliament, which means that you've got largely American companies that are exerting huge amounts of influence on the democratic systems of countries all around the world. And I think a starting point would be different legislatures and different regulators and different governments sitting down together and talking about how is it that the internet is global now, and everybody has a stake in making sure that their democracies are intact. And so what is it about the internet that needs to be looked at? What are the common questions that each country has? And working together on a common solution. And I honestly think that it may actually require a multinational approach, particularly when you see how Mark Zuckerberg refuses to engage with most countries. So I think that may have to happen at an international level or cross-parliamentary level.
So just finally, domestically, would you say that it would be in Canadians' interests to have Canadian political parties come under our Privacy Protection Act so that there is more accountability for even how political parties use this information.
Yeah. So
Quickly,
the
Mr.
only
Wylie.
issue, the only issue that I think would need to really be carefully considered is if you start to require political parties to have opt-in consent before they talk to voters, or if they receive some kind of opt-out, they can never engage that voter again, you may create a situation where you have an election and the entire electorate you are unable to reach because of those barriers. Our democratic process is a very special thing, and actually I think that there is value sometimes in one party approaching a voter who doesn't initially just agree with them or doesn't even necessarily want to talk to them, because that's partly what debate and the political process is about. It's about challenging conversations. You can't have challenging conversations if we create rules that prevent political parties from actually engaging with voters. It's different for companies than with elections, but in particular with elections, I think that's a really important thing for people to think about, is that it feels good to say we should have opt-in if parties don't want to talk. If you don't want to talk to parties, they shouldn't have to bother you at the door. But actually, sometimes that's essential in maintaining our democratic process. So the only caution that I would have there is just making sure that it's not so overly restrictive that 5 years down the road, parties can't engage with the electorate.
Thank you, Mr. Wylie. Thank you, Mr. Angus, too. I have a question.